Welcome to Busch Hall Conversations. And this is our virtual space for the Busch-Reisinger Museum to think about issues of art and identity as they relate to our collections and our programs and future exhibitions. So I'm very grateful to everyone tuning in today, and also, of course, to our German friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum who support this conversation series. Before we begin today, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the ancestral and traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and we at the university strive to honor this relationship. So I'm very excited to welcome, or I should also say welcome back, Maja Wismer to the Busch-Reisinger Museum. And Maja is now the head of art after 1960 and contemporary art at the Kunstmuseum Basel. And back in the day, she was our rank B, actually our inaugural rank B and Pamela M. Tia curatorial fellow in the Busch-Reisinger Museum. So first and foremost, welcome back, Maja.
Thank you so much.
And the occasion of our conversation today is really, we're actually sort of at the tail end, I suppose, of the centennial of the artist Joseph Beuys. And of course, when I, started thinking, what would I do for the centennial of Joseph Beuys? If I knew if I did anything, it would have to be with Maja, because Maja was actually the one who really delved into the Busch-Reisinger's collection of multiples by Joseph Beuys back 2012 to 2014 and curated pretty much every installation until recently that has been on view at the Harvard Art Museums of Beuys's multiples. So let me just say I'm very grateful, Maja, to all of that incredible research that you did, and really the incredible mileage we got out of it for our galleries at the museum. And so that was just sort of my way in. But of course, Maja, you've been thinking about Beuys in your position at the Kunstmuseum Basel. And I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, just to give some background on how you've been thinking about Beuys. And I should say you must be quite exhausted because you just did a 24-hour happening this weekend.
That's right. Yeah, I was going to say the mileage that came out for me on my initial engagement with Beuys at the Harvard Art Museum has been tremendous. Completely unexpected. I wasn't applying for the position that I have now, being fully aware that I would completely be able to rely on my Beuys background, which I really gained through the Harvard Art Museums. Almost 10 years ago, I arrived with hardly any knowledge about Beuys, I have to say. Joseph Beuys, for me, was definitely someone I kind of avoided during my education. I just felt his art is overpowering everything. I can't cope. I don't even dare to go near. And the Harvard Art Museum really allowed me. I mean, they gave me a key basically to the storage cases where the Beuys multiples are kept. I guess they're still kept there. So I got the key and I was there by myself day by day and really dived into it. Exactly. And so
let me just interrupt you real quick, Maja, just to mention for those who are not familiar with the multiple, it's an addition to artwork, and the museum owns nearly 500 of those. So that's why the storage access was so important. So you could really cover a massive amount of material during your time. Sorry to interrupt.
No. And anyone who has ever worked in a museum or had a guided tour behind the scenes understands how much a sign of trust is actually. Art conservators at museums really keep the storages safe and clear. So yeah, I felt quite empowered then. And also I, object by object, I would say I kind of I didn't lose my respect, but I lost a certain timidness in engaging with the work by Joseph Beuys. I mean, it became quite a casual exercise in a way, and I think I still really profit of that. I mean, at the Kunstmuseum Basel, we hold several big installations by Joseph Beuys, and I tend to say that Joseph Beuys was the one artist who brought international contemporary art really to Basel a year before Art Basel was founded. So he was an important contributor at the time, and we kept, or since then, his work has been on display at the museum. And I really saw this passing year as my chance to further engage with the work and also tell the stories behind it and what it meant when Joseph Beuys' work came to Basel to a younger generation. Yeah.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. You started out by saying, Beuys was also an artist that you initially avoided. And I think that's really telling, right? Because I think that's still actually the way that a lot of people think about Beuys and his work, which is why I was really keen to have this conversation with you, because my feeling is, we recently did a walkthrough with a local Boston reporter, and, I mentioned that you and I were working, and that's something we'll be sure to share on the Instagram. Maja and I recently worked together with the Goethe Institute Boston on a video about Beuys' multiples. And so I sort of mentioned this in passing, and his first reaction was, well, I mean, the way that it kind of, the way that people approach it is through this sense of pathos, right? This kind of like, he's sort of so big, and the themes are so big, German history, his own personal symbolism, right? So it's interesting that actually you say that the sort of literal access, right, to the multitudes of, these artworks actually helped you shift your perspective. So I was hoping you could say a little bit more about that, because I do feel, this is a forum for thinking about art and identity, right? So, how could we shift that perception, right? That very strong perception and that kind of overwhelming feeling that I think a lot of people have when confronted with Beuys.
Well, I definitely think it's about, I'm really speaking from a museum perspective. I did end up actually writing a dissertation on the multiples by Joseph Beuys, but I'm really a museum person. So for me, it is crucial to take the works on site as a starting point, but actually also take visitors' reactions to it seriously and observing, okay, maybe so much isn't happening at first sight if you don't tell the stories around it, because we are very much now in a situation where we are communicating Beuys without the artist, and he was so crucial all his life long, to be really, he was the most active advocate for his work. I mean, he had a whole group of people working with him, around him, be it collectors, gallerists, or colleague and friends, artists. But he himself was really the most ambassador, I would say, and he's not here anymore. So to talk about the work, and so it's really about recreating the historical moments of when he spoke about the work. It's not that we would take up the position of Joseph Beuys and speak on his behalf. How would we? But
well, that's one of the criticisms, right, of Beuys, or has been one of the criticisms, right, is that those who wrote about it, or curators who made possible, right, his vision, were in some ways just blindly sort of slaves to his vision and to his person, right? So that, that has been the question, right? Without the artist imbuing the work with this kind of, that's why I said, I started with sort of saying pathos was the word that the local reporter used. And I thought that is, I think, the criticism as well, right? So I just noticed, as we move away from that also in time, right? I mean, that, we're talking about a completely new generation of museum goers who, didn't grow up with boys on the cover of Spiegel magazine, so why, I mean, and it really came out, I think, this year with the centennial, right? That, I mean, Boys 2021, I had to really think as a curator in the United States, like, well, what does that mean? Like, it's very different than, let's say, if and that's why I was curious about the Basel context as well, because I think it is very different than being a curator at a German institution, for example.
For sure, for sure. And being reminded of this being a forum of art and identity, right?
Yeah.
I really think I can highly recommend our colleague Philipp Ursprung's book, actually, which came out just in time for Joseph Beuys' birthday in May. It's called Capital Revolution. What was it? Capital Revolution. Like
I'll link it. I'll link it in our Instagram.
Yeah, that. Three very capital terms that Joseph Beuys used. I think so far he's working on an English version, but he really takes the approach that occupying ourselves with Joseph Beuys' work and legacy today is a fantastic chance to recontextualize the historic moment, really understand what was the historic situation where an artist could have such an impact on political issues, but also what was the context that an artist was, so received, so debated, so controversially. So I really think Joseph Beuys is a perfect fit for a discussion on art and identity in a way, and especially coming from an institution like yours, where sort of there's an ethnographical interest in German culture in a way. It's like a perfect example to dive in and really understand also that this work was very much coined by the political situation in the mainly 70s and 1980s, where the party system was debated, where the inner border was becoming a fact, but then dissolved also. So I think there's a lot to gain out of that. Yeah. But I kind of lost your question now here, so I'm sorry.
No, I don't. I think that was, I mean, whatever, I think that was fantastic. And I think it resonated with me. You said in one of our early conversations when we reconnected around Beuys this year that, even your thinking as a curator in Basel was around moving, Beuys from the contemporary realm, right, to sort of the historic, right, which I think fits with Philipp Ursprung's kind of, notion that actually, it has long been, and I think there has been work, that has been happening over the last 10 or 15 years on Beuys that's doing that, right? That's sort of starting to say, okay, artist is no longer here anymore. We're kind of, to a certain extent, moving beyond the question of this, invented biography, right? And what is the historical context? And of course, for me, it's also the historical context in Germany at that time, and when that reception of, for us, the multiples, the edition artworks, that's really the story that I think that we're aiming to tell. And I think we have told it to a certain extent in the galleries with the work that you did during your fellowship.
Yeah, I definitely think that we achieved something, and yeah, I think it's about I think you are in a incredibly fortunate situation to have so many of these multiples. So now you can reshake them, on a 6-month basis or maybe 3-month basis, and have some rest a bit because some of them are very fragile, but sort of continue to tell the story and maybe also build upon the scholarship that has happened since I researched last time. Because as you said, it's the amount of helpful work that I've come across in the last couple of years has continuously risen. So I think there's a lot that you can build up on. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that's also, you know, one of the things that's always been happening in our galleries is putting Beuys in also an international context, right? Which is, you know, again, to the issue of kind of art and identity. I'm thinking, you know, I came to Beuys as a German artist, right? I was a Germanist. I was intrigued by, you know, this was in, you know, the late 90s, right? I was intrigued by, you know, the artist who first, you know, addressed the Holocaust in his work, and, you know, those kinds of questions. And I feel like that's, you know, sort of still relevant for thinking about Beuys, but what are kind of new ways in. So I was hoping you would share a little bit about how sort of you've thought about Beuys, or how it went this past weekend with your 24-hour happening. I know you had like over 30 invited guests and performances and music, and it was related to Beuys. So first of all, how did it go? And do you feel that opened up a dialogue or a new way into the work for you and for your audience?
Well, I think it went well, considering the circumstances that museums are maybe not the place to hold a 24-hour happening. I mean, there are reasons that we have opening hours, but apart from that, I think there were some really sparkling moments. And one comment that was brought up to me quite a few times is, "Oh, I'm so glad it's so far from Beuys."
Oh.
So I think there's still, for some people, there's still an oversaturation with Beuys, or maybe the media Beuys. So that was nice to understand how far it can go, and it still can be communicated under the umbrella structure Joseph Beuys. But then for me personally, it was really understanding the pushing the boundaries, you know, doing the extremes, like overdoing it in a way. And that is still a quality that I cherish in his work, actually, like being, you know, keeping the pace in a way, keeping the urgency, and keeping it vibrant in a way. And that was a good reminder. And yeah, so overall, I think it was a nice experience, and I think we took it quite literal also, that Joseph Beuys himself asked for museums to become, you know, places, sites of debate, not just knowledge production, but actually bringing the production up front and putting it up for debate. So actually, in the aftermath now of the 24 hours, we're having a continued communication and education program happening at where the 24 hours were happening. So
so it was really a jumping off point for that. I mean, first your kind of reinstallation, and then this as a jumping off point for ongoing conversations.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. And it was a brilliant moment when, you know, the world-known architect Jacques Herzog, who was a protagonist in the 1970s, who brought Joseph Beuys to the Basel Carnival at the time. So he's been quite an ambassador back then. And so we had invited him to go on a tour and take us where the carnival was going through the old town of Basel with Joseph Beuys. And he remembered some facts, but it also, anyhow, it became a very, very exciting report on how it had been and what it had changed. And it was very gratifying for him also to hear that he is so appreciative of us now having moved the Beuys works in a new context. And he really sort of articulated that he is really grateful and very curious to see how the work will going into a next phase in a way. That was a really nice moment, and also understanding that a certain trajectory is being continued, although, you know, from a very different angle, and that the time was ready for it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the fact that we are talking about 100 years since Beuys's birth, right, and sort of already should signal to us, that this is, this is historic. I mean, this is art history now in a way. And I think, something you had said to me recently about, many of the Beuys installations, like the one in Basel, which had several kind of, iterations in different spaces, but also many others across Germany, probably how I first encountered Beuys's work myself, haven't changed or don't tend to change or do. And I think that also brings with it that feeling that you mentioned at the outset, right? That it's sort of like, ugh, I can't sort of deal with that. And in some ways, there's no way sort of not to deal with it. So I always had said, to students, I would say, imagine sort of thinking about the history of art in the United States and not thinking about Andy Warhol. I mean, there's just, there are certain figures who, also, as you were saying, give us a way into that time period like no other.
Absolutely. No, yeah. And yeah, and moving to work. moving to work is a good way of opening windows, and museums and windows. I think we should open those windows.
I like that. I like that very much. I mean, we don't have the same challenge. Obviously, we don't have a large scale installation, and so in fact, I think you're absolutely right. And I think actually, and that's and I will post the Goethe Institute video as soon as it goes live, where Maja and I discuss what the multiple can do. And I think that's, for me, also, really continuing to think about that idea, and also thinking about other artists who've turned to the multiple, and contemporary artists who continue to think about that legacy. Of course, it wasn't one that was just, that Beuys was engaging with. And that's actually, I think, for us, really been the way into that work, and thinking about, how do ideas spread, how are ideas communicated. But, well, this has been fun. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add, thinking about Joseph Beuys today. Any other lessons you've learned?
Always a good topic for a conversation, I would say, and come by, rediscover, even more so, and yeah, let's keep asking questions and shaking up felt, I think.
Shaking up felt, I like it. Thank you so much, Maja, and I look forward to sharing both our Goethe Institute video, also the details about Philipp Ursprung's book, although it sounds like it is only available in German. And also tomorrow we'll post several wonderful installation shots of Maja's installations at the Busch-Reisinger Museum, Harvard Art Museums over the years, so everyone can get a sense of our collection, and also the way that Maja transformed it over the years that have since intervened. I can't believe it's been almost 10. But I really appreciate your coming and joining us at the Busch-Reisinger Museum, and thanks to everyone who joined today. And yeah, stay tuned for more on art and identity on our Busch Hall account, and to our next conversation next month, which will actually be with the artist Hans Christian Schenk. And we're actually not going to do it on Instagram, but I will update you about that. It will be one of our Art Talk Live conversations instead. So just a slight change of format for next month. But thanks again, Maja, and get some rest after your 24-hour happening.
Thank you so much, Lynette. It was wonderful. Take care.
Take care. Bye now.
Bye.